Hello, I'm going to talk to you today about two families who arrived separately at Fort Walla Walla 162 years ago in fall of 1859. Although they made their homes in the valley, it wasn't a planned journey's end for either of them. Both families had originally set their sights on the Willamette Valley. Their trip west and their early life here is intertwined with history of the valley. I will be using quite a few quotes for this presentation from the pioneers themselves and from their grandchildren. It is a chance to hear the story directly from them, even after this many years. At the end of the presentation, I will show you where these stories can be found. The wagon train company with the Amos Barnett family reached the valley on September 5th, 1859, after driving their tired oxen north from the Oregon Trail and camped by Fort Walla Walla. They had been on the road for 5 months and 6 days. 2 days earlier, after they had reached the summit of the Blue Mountains, their group took the fork in the road north to Fort Walla Walla. The remainder of the company continued west to the Willamette Valley. Several members of their group were sick with typhoid fever, so they decided they had better go to the fort where government doctors could help care for the sick. Soon after the Barnet wagons arrived at the fort, additional family members became ill with typhoid fever, which was contracted by consuming contaminated food or water. It was highly contagious and could be passed along to others in the family with close contact. There was no treatment at the time, and it had a mortality rate of 10 to 20%. Those who contracted the disease had high fevers and diarrhea that could last for weeks. They became weak and lost their appetite. Within 5 weeks of reaching the fort, 2 of the men who accompanied the Barnett family, John and Alpheus Milliken, and Amos and Mary's 15-year-old daughter, Theodate, died of the disease. Letters home to the family indicate they were buried side by side, although we don't know where that burial occurred. In a sad letter to his brother on December 6, 1859, Amos outlined their troubles and said his wife and 2 of their children had been so sick they did not think they would live. He said he put off writing letters because he wanted to tell them whether they had made it through their illness or not. Even with these troubles, the family back in Iowa would have been relieved to receive the letter. They had heard that the whole family had been killed in an attack by Indians. Correspondence between Washington Territory and the family back home would have taken a long time. Letters from Fort Walla Walla went first to Oregon coast, then by boat around Cape Horn, then to New York, then back across the country to its destination in Iowa. The William and Priscilla Moore family stopped near Immigrant Springs in the Blue Mountains of Oregon on their trek to the Willamette Valley. Quote, that evening, 2 men from Walla Walla rode into camp, bringing with them 2 pack horses loaded with corn and wheat. Their mission was to attract immigrants to the Walla Walla area. The grain for the tired, worn oxen was part of the sales effort. The men appeared to be honest when they described fertile soil, substantial yields, and a mild climate. It is easy to see why William and Priscilla faced many weeks of extremely difficult travel to reach the Willamette Valley, chose to stop at Walla Walla, unquote. There was another consideration as well. Their oldest daughter, Serena, had made the trip with her husband, Daniel Clayton, and their newborn son. Quote, Serena had weakened progressively as the journey went on, and by the time they reached Oregon, all in the family feared she would die before they reached their destination, unquote. William and Priscilla's family arrived at Fort Walla Walla 10 days after the Barnett family on September 15, 1859. So who are these people? First, the Amos and Mary Barnett family. Joel Barnett, their son, who made the trip as a young child, described his parents like this, quote, Amos was a tall, square-built man with sandy hair. Mary was a pleasant-faced woman with black eyes and long black hair, a devoted mother, ever ready to help the needy and always looking on the bright side of life. The children were Asa, Theodate, Thomas, Ellis, Joel, Julia, Emma, and Ira, ranging from the ages of 18 to 2. This family were Quakers of the old William Penn type, who were always in their places for worship on the Sabbath day, and that would lay aside their labor on 4th day, meaning Wednesday, for 1 hour of worship at the meeting house, which would often be a silent hour, unquote. The Religious Society of Friends, or Quakers, object to using the names of pagan gods for days and months. For this reason, they substitute numbers for the days, for the names of the months, such as first month and second month, and use the same pattern for days of the week. Amos, born in Clinton County, Ohio on 8th day, 3rd month, 1820, was born to Thomas and Theodate Vernon Barnet. He and his parents were all birthright members of the Religious Society of Friends. Until the 1940s, a person born into a Quaker family was automatically a member, so the term birthright. Amos had been on the move starting as a young child. He was 7 when he moved with his parents from his place of birth in Ohio to Indiana. When he was 20 in 1840, he married Sarah Rhodes in Warren, Indiana. In April 1845, they were granted a certificate to join the monthly meeting, which is the name for a Quaker congregation, in Pleasant Plain, Iowa. It was just over a year later that his wife died in October 1846, leaving him with 3 young children. He returned to Indiana 3 years later to marry his late wife's cousin, Mary Mendenhall. After their marriage, they returned to Iowa. Remember that in these early years, these states where they lived were primitive frontier areas. In the winter of 1858-59, Amos and his family began preparations for another move, this time to the far west in Oregon Territory. There's no documented explanation for why Amos and his family desired to move west. However, during this time, many families were anxious to go there. The philosophy of manifest destiny contributed to the movement to the Western lands. Many farmers, merchants, and adventurers dreamed of having a better way of life by taking advantage of free or low-cost land. It was also a time of political unrest in the states leading up to the Civil War that was to start in 1861. Iowa was divided politically with cultural and economic ties to the South, as well as citizens who played an essential part in the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad consisted of a series of safe houses provided by abolitionists sympathetic to the plight of the enslaved people. The runaway slaves were passed from one station to another until they reached a non-slave state or could escape to Canada or Mexico. The Barnett family was staunchly abolitionist. Up to the Revolutionary War, Quakers also owned slaves, but later proclaimed that slavery was against God's will, and they were urged to free their slaves. William Barnett, Amos's brother, who was also living in Iowa, was involved in the Underground Railroad. Quote, "In the days of slavery, their home was a regular depot on the Underground Railroad, and many a poor traveling son and daughter of Africans' downtrodden race had been helped onward by them to freedom and a better life," unquote. Whatever the reason for the move, Amos and his family sold their farm near Keokuk County, Iowa, and began arranging for the long trip. These are the Barnett children who made the trip west with Amos and Mary: Asa, Theodate, Thomas, Ellis, Joel, Julia, Emma, Ira. 3 additional children were later born to them while they lived in Walla Walla. Here's a picture of William and Priscilla Moore taken when they were older. On June 6, 1815, William Moore was born in Pennsylvania, but soon moved with his family to Wayne County, Ohio. His father died there when William was about 5 or 6 years old. The family story is that his father died when he was kicked in the head by a horse. His mother remarried about 3 years later to William Culbertson. William and Priscilla started their life together in Worcester, Wayne County, Ohio, where they were married in February 1835 in her mother's home. According to family stories, this was against her widowed mother's wishes. A 19-year-old man with no land or money and who was a Quaker should have no place in the life of a well-off Episcopalian family. According to Ethel Moore, granddaughter of William and Priscilla, quote, "Grandma Priscilla was a practical nurse and was the nurse for the wagon train on their trek west. She had 2 sisters who were Red Cross nurses in the Civil War. She had a nephew who was an outstanding doctor and had his practice on the Ohio Canal. The Ayers family was gifted musically and medically. Priscilla had a beautiful high soprano voice. She was tall and slender and very pretty with dark hair and eyes." William and Priscilla did not stay long in Ohio, moving to Indiana soon after the birth of their first child in 1836. In 1850, they lived in DeKalb County, Indiana, where he was a farmer. 8 children were born in Indiana between 1838 and 1854, before they moved to Iowa about 1856. Their youngest daughter, Eunice, was born in Bramer County, Iowa in July 1857. Soon after this, they decided to move to the Willamette Valley in Oregon Territory. Western fever, or was it politics? Family stories say that William decided to move to the Western Territories because of his opposition to slavery and a concern with the political unrest and potential war. The late 1850s was a time of serious and sometimes violent confrontations between those who wanted to retain slavery and those who opposed it. The West was free territory, meaning that slavery was not allowed. If war were to come within the next several years, William's older sons would have been the right age to become caught up in the fighting. Western fever may have also played a part, as the family had moved almost 1,200 miles in their journey from Pennsylvania at his birth to their current residence in Iowa. The option of free or low-cost land enticed many families to go west. This chart shows William, Priscilla, and their 10 children as they prepared for the move in 1857. After selling their farm, they moved nearly 300 miles, about 20 days by ox team, to St. Joseph, Missouri, a jumping off point to the Oregon Trail. Once there, they heard of Indian troubles along the trail and rented a farm while they waited for the troubles to subside. In early April 1859, they started the western move. William, Priscilla's oldest daughter, Serena, had married Daniel Clayton in 1855, and they decided to make the journey with her family. While they were waiting to start their trip, their first son died, and Serena gave birth to her second son on March 9, 1859, about 3 weeks before they were to leave. By the time they left Missouri on the way to the Willamette Valley, William, age 44, and Priscilla, who turned 43 as they entered the valley, had 9 children still in their household between 21 and 2 years old. Because of the size of their family, they prepared 2 wagons to be pulled by oxen for the trip. Their daughter and her family had their own wagon. The Barnett family also began making preparations for the trip. They purchased 2 new wagons of the wide tread type and the necessary bows and covers. They bought tents and camp outfits, including 2 sheet iron stoves that were to be hung on the back end of the wagon when not in use. They would have decided which of their treasured belongings they would bring with them. One such item was a rocking chair made by Amos's uncle. This chair was still in the family in 1925, when Amos's son Joel displayed it at a party celebrating his 50th wedding anniversary. And they prepared a carriage described as a good one with a top and side curtains, and bought a new harness for it. 2 horses, Charlie, a big black horse, and his mate, a brown mare named Whip, would pull the carriage. They had 6 pair of oxen for each of the 2 wagons. Each pair of oxen required a yoke, a wooden beam to enable them to pull together. For their trip, they purchased extra yokes and several log chains to use as brakes on the wagons. They also had other livestock and horses. Their dog, named Tony, a dark gray shepherd dog with a long plumey tail, was one of the best with stock that could be found. Quote, on the 31st day of March, 1859, the teams were hitched up and they were ready to start. The neighbors and friends had come over for the last farewell, some shaking hands, some more softly crying, for in some cases it would be the last time they would ever see each other, unquote. Their party consisted of Amos, age 39, and married, age 32, and their 8 children, Alpheus and John Milliken, who were hired on as teamsters and to help with preparations, and Joseph Baker, hired to help take care of the loose stock. The first part of their trip was in the settled area of Iowa, but as they neared the start of the trail at Council Bluffs, they stopped to make any necessary repairs to the wagons and equipment and buy provisions to last for the rest of the trip. They didn't know when they would be able to purchase more supplies, but also had to be careful not to overburden the teams. The Moore family would have had a similar task to prepare for the journey. William carried a Kentucky rifle, a 6-foot-long 25 caliber muzzleloader. Quote, the barrel was rifled and the gun was quite accurate. A lead ball was placed on a patch of greased muslin and pushed down with a ramrod. It had 2 triggers, one set the hair trigger, which once set was quite sensitive, unquote. Unfortunately, this gun was destroyed in a house fire around 1954. One other helpful item they carried with them was a black iron kettle. It was 24 inches across the top and was 16 inches high with a bale handle. It weighed over 40 pounds. After finalizing preparations for the long trip, both the Moore and Barnett families started along the Oregon Trail. The Moore family began at St. Louis, Missouri, and the Barnett family at Council Bluffs, Iowa. After several days of travel, the trails would converge near Grand Island, Nebraska on the Platte River. The much-traveled path was not a single road. It was as much as 2 to 3 miles wide at places to allow animals to graze and for the pioneers to find game, water, and fuel for cooking. It was to be a long trip, almost 2,000 miles with many hazards. The trail wound through Missouri and present-day Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming, Idaho, and Oregon. There were accidents with guns, runaway horses, drownings at river crossings, and diseases, as well as unfriendly Indian tribes. No laws governed the wagon trains. No government had enforceable jurisdiction along the way. Because of this, the members of the wagon trains made their own rules and enforced them. Except near a few forts, they had to defend themselves against any Indian attacks or outlaws. About 2,000 pioneers used the Oregon Trail in 1859, which had been in use since the 1840s. With a trail this well traveled, it became difficult to find feed for their livestock, and hunting for travelers became more difficult. They also had few resources to treat the sick and injured along the way. The Barnett family started their journey west in a wagon train consisting of about 35 wagons. With 3 yoke of oxen to each wagon, it was quite a long train. When leaving some room between the wagons to alleviate the dust, the long caravan would sometimes be a mile long. About 40 head of loose cattle followed behind. The Moore family, starting at St. Joseph in late April, left with their wagons, carriage, and livestock in a line of 50 wagons. During the first part of the trip, the main trouble was monotony, and they had no Indian problems. When the Moores reached the Platte River, it was at flood stage. They crossed the river by forcing the teams to swim the river. The water ran into the wagon box and everything got wet, so they had to stop on the other side and dry out their goods. The wagons used by most pioneers were called Prairie Schooners. The wooden bed was about 4 feet wide and 10 feet long. They could be caulked with tar and floated across the river when necessary. To make the wheels more maneuverable, the back ones were larger than the front. Large wheels roll over rough terrain more efficiently, and small ones turn in a tighter radius. The wagons could carry a ton of cargo and passengers, but it would be a very bumpy ride with no springs or suspension. In most cases, people would choose to walk or ride a horse alongside the wagon. Just think of carrying all of your worldly goods in a space this size, and you would need to carry enough supplies to not only make the trip, but to take goods and tools necessary to start your new life at your destination in the West. Depending on the weather and the conditions of the trail, most wagon trains traveled about 10 to 20 miles per day. While not knowing if the Barnett or Moore families had an odometer, it's not unusual for someone in their group to have one to measure the distances. This image shows how they would be attached to the wheels. The gears were set to mark both miles and 10-mile increments. When reaching the place where the trails converged at Grand Island, Nebraska, the Barnett family reported that the roads were generally good. The water was clear with plenty of fish, and they saw some sod houses where homesteaders were living. About the time the Barnett family reached Fort Laramie in Wyoming, they experienced a severe storm with a stiff wind and rain. The wind blew so hard they had to tie the wagons down so they would not blow over. Quote, "For an hour or more, the storm raged, blinding lightning and deafening thunder succeeding one another. By the following day, the storm had passed and they were able to resume the travel that afternoon. The rain had settled the dust along the road," unquote. By this time, the travel was beginning to wear on both livestock and families. They met 3 men on foot who told them Indians had stolen all their livestock, and they were on their way to the fort to have them pull their wagons there. While pasturing their animals, the Indians had ridden up to the horses, gave a war whoop, waved their blankets, and drove the horses away. After hearing this, the Barnett Company determined they would post plenty of guards with the livestock. After finding that one of the Barnett oxen was missing, Alpheus Milliken asked for a horse and permission to go back 20 miles to locate Old Baldy. Amos told him, quote, "As to the horse, you are welcome to it, but it is too dangerous a trip and the steer is not worth running the risk." Alpheus left anyway and took 2 6-shooters and a double-barrel shotgun and went after the missing animal. They could not wait for him to return, as the following day the captain of the train gave orders to move on, unquote. Alpheus was able to locate the ox after riding all night. After several days and nights of travel, he was able to rejoin the camp. The Barnett family party reached Devil's Gate in central Wyoming about July 1st. Several days later, they crossed the Rocky Mountain Divide. Joel Barnett, who was 7 at the time, described their time like this, quote, "One day we traveled about 18 miles through the desert without water or grass. It is impossible to tell of the suffering we went through with that day. A greater part of the way, the women and children walked in the dry dust, and the children, being barefooted, cried because their feet were burned with the hot sand. Although every utensil that would hold water had been filled in the morning, the supply soon ran low because of the scorching sun made our thirst even greater than usual. The lolling tongues of the faithful oxen warned us we must share with them if they were to arrive at the next watering place, unquote. Several days later, not far from where the California Trail split from the Oregon Trail, they came upon remnants of the burned out wagon train. They saw several graves that a passing caravan had probably dug. Both the Barnett and Moore families would have been nearby. This was near what is now known as the City of Rocks, just south of Burley, Idaho. It was there that Amos Barnett became quite ill. After a few more days of travel along the Snake River in some rough road and desert areas, he began to improve. By then it was about the 1st of August. It was also near there that two young adults of the Barnett family party, Josephine and Joy, were kidnapped by some outlaws, including several Indians and a white man. After traveling with their captors for the rest of the day, they escaped during the night, but had no idea where they were and where to find the wagon train. After looking for them for a day and a half, the train's captain decided they could wait no longer. Quote, "They decided that we had done all that we could do as we were still on the desert with danger on every side, and only enough armed men to protect our little company, and to divide and send some back to look for those that were lost would endanger the entire camp. And as there was no feed for the stock, we were compelled to move on again. It was a sad day's travel with a heartsick company that pulled into camp that night," unquote. After being lost in the wilderness and hiding from the outlaws and wild animals for several days, Josephine and Joy found a small group of 4 wagons on a little-used trail who fed them. The group then headed to the main traveled road. Meanwhile, Indians attacked their small group repeatedly over the next night. They soon found a company of wagons on the main trail, and it turned out to be the company with the Barnett family. This slide shows some of the rock formations at the City of Rocks, near where the trail to California split from the Oregon Trail. More desert travel in the August heat was ahead of them. Quote, "Some of the teamsters would ride on the front of their wagons, and others would walk beside their teams. The women would walk to lighten the load and would push to help the poor teams up the hills," unquote. The teamsters cracked their whips and drove on through the sun and dust, hoping to find water soon. One night they kept on until midnight with exhausted livestock after having no water or feed. They had driven about 30 miles. The following day, they came to a pile of discarded log chains, food barrels, wagon parts, and personal items like books, clothing, and furniture. They had likely seen other junk heaps of discarded supplies along the trail. Many families purchased more supplies of all kinds than could be carried successfully for their long journey. The Barnett Company and other travelers looked the pile over, took anything they might need, and added worn out equipment or things they could no longer carry into the stack. It was there that Asa Barnett, the 17-year-old son of Amos Barnett, threw an old shovel with his name carved on it onto the pile. Or was it a belt buckle with his name on it? The story passed down in the Moore and Barnett families are different. Whatever object it was, Amos Barnett had his name on it, and Sarah Moore, the 11-year-old daughter of William Moore, found it when their party passed the same junk pile. Sarah claimed it for her own, declared that she would find the owner, and she would find that man and marry him. They soon came to 3 islands in the Snake River. Then after a short time, they came to more sandy, dusty, and rocky roads. Their livestock had become so weak, they had a hard time pulling the wagons. One of Amos's best oxen died, and one of his horses was sick. The children were again forced to walk barefoot on the hot sand, and their lips and eyes got sore. When the Moore family got to Fort Boise, they stopped to see how the conditions were further on. It was late summer by then, and the rivers were not flooding. Another member of the Barnett family got sick, although Amos was slowly recovering. Quote, "Quite a number of the company were much discouraged as the livestock were nearly worn out. They threw everything away that we could spare. 2 men left their wagons, and one threw away $75 worth of tools. And this would have been equal to about a month or 2, maybe 2 months worth of wages. It was a great sacrifice to leave them after hauling them so far," unquote. They continued their travel and soon came to the Grand Ronde Valley. Just when they thought things could not get worse, they saw a fire and wind coming from the southwest. They set a backfire and dammed up a creek to have enough water to wet down their wagons. Fortunately, no damage was done except for smoke. On the Grand Ronde River, they caught 50 nice salmon, some of them weighing 10 pounds. As difficult as the trip was for all family members, the women on the wagon train still had to feed and care for their young children. Serena Moore Clayton, who bore her infant son just weeks before starting their trek, was quite ill. Quote, her husband had prepared a bed in the wagon for her and the baby, but Serena weakened progressively as the journey went on. And by the time they reached Oregon, all in the family feared she would die. Daniel Clayton led a cow behind their wagon and would stop and milk the cow to have milk for the baby, unquote. Fortunately, she was able to regain her health and lived to the age of 80 when she died from complications of the flu in 1917. When they came to the fork in the road where the trail divided to go north to Walla Walla or continue to the Willamette Valley, both families decided to go to Walla Walla. The Barnett family arrived on September 5th, 1859. The Moore party entered the valley 10 days later on September 15th, 1859. It isn't easy to convey the sights and sounds and feelings of those pioneer travelers. In a letter to his family, soon after he arrived in Walla Walla, Amos wrote about the deaths of his daughter and their friends. Quote, why my family was so afflicted is more than I can tell. I was as well fixed as most of them. There were a great many that came and there was very little sickness on the plains, unquote. This is an image of Fort Walla Walla in 1862. So this was about 2 years after they arrived. In 1859, the region surrounding Fort Walla Walla was open to pioneers due to the recent treaty with the Indian tribes and their forced relocation to the reservations. But there was no inducement for farmers to settle in the valley since there was plenty of unoccupied land in the territories and no market for goods. Oregon had recently become a state in February of 1859, and Walla Walla had become a county in Washington Territory in 1854. The family of Emma Barnett, who had made the trip over the Oregon Trail with her family at the age of 3, described it later as, quote, a nearly uncivilized place, end quote. It was not until after these families had arrived in September that the county leadership settled on a name for the area surrounding the fort. On November 7th, 1859, the county commissioners gave it the name of Wallawa. The voting precinct near the fort had been previously known as Steptoville or Wailetpa. The first months in the valley were difficult for the Barnett family. Amos purchased a claim shortly after he arrived. Some of the men at the fort had put up a log cabin for his family, which was much better than living in the wagon while his family was sick. The deaths of his friends and his daughter were hard to bear. His wife and several other children had recovered. The 80-acre parcel of land Amos and his family first settled on was bordered by what is now Russell Creek Road, Dumping Road, Shelton Road, and South Wilbur Avenue. He later added 160 acres adjoining to the north and west. The yellow lines show where the original land was located and the red the additions. You can see Bernie's School up here at the top. There's a little white building. So this is School Avenue coming straight south to there. And this is Bryant along the top here. So it helps you get situated a little bit where that land is. Joel Barnett wrote this about Walla Walla, quote, when we came to this valley, this section was then reported as the most fertile and beautiful place in the territory. The town of Walla Walla was small. It was not long until it began to improve and build good storehouses, taverns, school buildings, and every few doors was a saloon. Numbers of good residences were going up. In the country, log schoolhouses were built with rough slab benches around the inside, the wall being used for the back of the seat. The teacher's seat was a cross-legged slab stool. The history books say there were no public schools in the county until 1862, although there was a school organized at Fort Walla Walla in 1857 and held at the whim of the commander. The first private school was said to be held in the winter of 1861-62. However, in the 1860 census on June 1st, 44 children between the ages of 6 and 17 in the county indicated they had gone to school within the past year. 10 of them were the children of the Moore and Barnett families. And there was one adult, J.C. Wilson, who listed his profession as a school teacher. There was no indication that the school at the fort was in operation that year, since none of the 9 school-age children in that precinct had attended school. The 1860 Social Statistics Census, also taken on June 1st, showed $629 had been collected for school taxes the previous year. Joel goes on to say that farmers were continually improving their ranches and raising stock and grain. The Barnett Ranch was known all over the valley as the Quaker Ranch. When Amos wrote letters home in November and December 1859, he had this to say about the valley, quote, "This is a well-watered valley, spring branches running in various ways, and along these is farming land and fine woods. But for good building timber, they have to go to the mountains. There is plenty of pine which they haul to the valley, which I think is 20 miles across. Work is $2 to $3 per day, carpenter $5, blacksmith $5. Farm hands get from $50 to $60 per month. A team can make $6 to $10 per day. I think this valley is better for stock than for raising grain, though they can raise corn. Wheat and oats do well, and vegetables do well so far as they've been tried. I have bought us a claim and they rate high. This was rated at $550. We put Lies, who was an ox, in at $250. One cow and old Baldy at another, and one of them yellow colts at another 100. Old Dove's yellow colt was stolen from us soon after we came into the valley. While we were so sick, we could not watch them. We owe the most of 100 yet. We got a good hewed log house and 5 acres broke. There's a good spring on it. I believe I must see things a little different before I recommend thee to come very strong. Though if we had a right good settlement here, I might be satisfied," end quote. This is not the Barnett cabin, but it is the Ransom Clark cabin, which was built about a year earlier, but it's also built with hewn logs and is now located here on the grounds of Fort Walla Walla Museum. When William Moore arrived at Fort Walla Walla, he met a man named William Fletcher who told him some available land near his. They first camped out near the Fletcher home on a creek, then called Moore Creek, while they built their house that winter. Their land was located on what is now Reeser Road, east of School Avenue, where the road takes a right turn and follows the section line. Serena Moore, Clayton, and her husband Daniel purchased land near them to the south. In the spring of 1860, so not long after they arrived, Priscilla Jane Moore had married Sam Caldwell, who had made the trip west with them as a teamster. He was 22 and she was 19. They also lived near her father, William. So here is Reeser Road here, and here's where the road turns right and follows the section line near the William Moore land. Here's the 1860 census. And over here on the right, these little tick marks, that shows where the children of these two families, Amos Barnett and William Moore, that they attended school within the past year. The agricultural census taken at the same time as the population schedule shows Amos Barnett had approved 15 of his then 145 acres. He had $250 worth of farming implements and machinery, 3 horses, silks, milk cows, 10 working oxen, 1 pig, and William Moore had improved 40 of his 160 acres. He had $200 worth of farming implements and machinery, 2 horses, 2 milk cows, 8 working oxen, with a total value of stock at $700. Remember Sarah Moore, who was determined to find the man who had thrown away the old shovel or belt buckle with his name on it and then marry him? William's daughter, Sarah E. Moore, married Asa Barnett, the oldest son of Amos, on January 11th, 1863. He was 21 and she was 15. The first photograph likely was taken near the time of her marriage. The second with her husband was taken at a later date. Ethel Moore, daughter of Leet Moore and a granddaughter of William Priscilla, told this story about the family. Quote, "While living on this land, the Moore family raised chickens and ducks and sold them to the Chinese in the wintertime. The Chinese called them duckies, and they used them for their New Year celebration. The Moores milked cows and sold butter to different ones at the garrison. The boys in the family would walk to town, about 6 miles, to sell butter and eggs. They would get $1 a pound for butter, and a 50-pound sack of flour would cost $20. Some of this product was packed into Idaho for the miners. Flour was so costly, the Moore family could not afford white bread, or only occasionally." The high cost of flour was likely because of the gold rush in 1860. Gold seekers came up the Columbia River and passed through Walla Walla, where they purchased provisions and mining equipment, tools, camping outfits, and animals. The farmers and merchants now had a market for goods. In November 1861, many miners left the mountains and sought Wallawa as a favorable place in which to winter and spend their money. The Washington Statesman noted, quote, that many left the diggings that paid them from $6 to $10 per day, fearing a hard winter, that the merchants of Orofino were refusing to sell goods, expecting much higher rates when the miners began to starve after being snowed in for the winter. Prices at Orofino in November 1861 were coffee, none to be had, sugar, scarce, candles, none for sale, bacon and beans, scarce, beef, 30 cents per pound. Can it be wondered at that the prospectors and miners sought Walla Walla as a cheaper resort in which to pass the winter? Unquote. Unfortunately for the farmers, the winter of 1861-62 was brutal. Farmers didn't have large barns with hay and other provisions for their livestock, and their homes were not constructed to keep out the well below zero temperatures that stayed for the entire month of January 1862. One estimate was that 1/2 to 2/3 of the livestock in the valley was lost to the cold and snow. In January 1862, the Washington Statesman wrote, quote, the late snow and cold weather have been disastrous for stock of every description. Cattle have died by hundreds from cold and starvation. One gentleman informs us that in going out to search for his stock on one of the small streams in the valley, he found upwards of 40 dead cattle in traveling a distance of only 3 miles. On the Walla Walla, we are informed, dead stock are strewn here and there along the river. Indian stock has suffered greatly and large bands of horses have perished, unquote. Frank Gilbert in his historic sketches told of the following, quote, with the opening of spring in 1862, the rush commenced and the merchants began to reap their harvest. The farmers were not so fortunate, for the hard winter had left many destitute of teams and seed grain, who were forced to buy at exorbitant prices or abandon agriculture and join the grand army of gold lunatics, unquote. Along with thousands of miners arriving from Portland and the Dalles, the Moore family participated in the gold rush. Quote, in 1861, 3 of the Moore sons walked to Cabin Gulch in Idaho to dig gold in that new discovery. Cabin Gulch is near Pierce, Idaho, and the walk would have been about 170 miles. At that time, Porter was 22, Moses 18, and John 16. It appears that Thomas, age 12, was too young for the venture. The boys mined until late in the year and then walked back to Walla Walla. In March of 1862, they walked back to their claims and worked there for that season. As the boys were walking up from the Clearwater River, Moses shot a ground squirrel and carried it onto Cabin Gulch. There he sold it for $5 to a miner who had stayed there all winter and had no meat in some time, unquote. By 1862, it was estimated that between 20 and 25,000 persons had reached or were on their way to and near the mines east of the Cascade Mountains. Most of them came through Walla Walla. The Barnett family decided in 1866 to return to Iowa in early spring. Joel Barnett reported, quote, we remained in the valley for 7 years and then decided to return to the States. We drove horses and mules, and old Charlie was one of the horses. We made the return to Iowa in about 3 months. We don't know the reasons for the return, perhaps because of the wild and woolly town that Walla Walla had become with the miners wintering there. Perhaps it was that the Civil War had ended and their old home in Iowa would have been peaceful now. Perhaps it was the pull of family back home. The return trip was more manageable and took 2 months less than their trip to the valley. In the 7 years since their arrival, there were more roads and towns along the way. Part of this would have been because of the influx of people and the mines in Idaho. They also traveled the desert areas of Idaho in the spring instead of in the summer heat. As they neared Iowa, they would have seen newly built railroads with nearby towns and villages. The Barnett family did leave one family member here, Amos Barnett, the husband of Sarah Moore Barnett. The others returned to Iowa and located near the present town of Earl in Madison County, Iowa, where they were welcomed back to the Bear Creek monthly meeting of the Quakers. 3 additional children had been born while they were in Walla Walla, and 2 more were added after they returned to Iowa. The young men in the Moore family had other adventures in addition to those in the early gold mines. Quote, in the late 1860s, Moses Moore drove a team on a freight wagon hauling supplies that were brought up the Columbia River by a stern wheeler. They crossed the Snake River at Lyons Ferry, went north on the Mullen Road, and on to the mines in British Columbia, Canada, unquote. Another story relates that in the 1870s, Porter and his brother-in-law had a logging camp near the mouth of the Grand Ronde River. Quote, the logs they cut were rafted downriver to Lewiston or near there. During that winter, Porter was forced by an attack of rheumatism to stay in bed. The Chief Joseph branch of the Nez Perce Indian tribe wintered near there, and several of the men came in each day to play poker. Porter lost regularly until he asked his partner to cut him a good sturdy club. The next day, whenever a visitor sat on his bed, Porter would drive him off, saying that having the bed move hurt his rheumatism. With no visitors sitting where he could see Porter's cards, Porter began to win, unquote. Most of the supplies and other goods not produced in the valley were transported up the Columbia River from Portland to Wallula, and then freighted by wagon to Walla Walla. That is until Dorsey Baker built his railroad in the 1870s. The Moore brothers, Porter, Moses, and John, worked as freight haulers along this route. Elsie Moore Wise told this story, quote, the freighters could make better time than the train. The train would get stuck on the hill by Touchy Station, and the freighters could beat the train into Walla Walla by hours. Sometimes they helped the train by using their teams. Dogs used to ride in the engine, and when necessary, would run ahead and chase any livestock off the track. On January 30th, 1871, William Moore and his son Moses, along with his son-in-law Daniel Clayton, took out a loan from M.B. Ward. They promised to pay Mr. Ward, a wealthy farmer and investor, $200 in gold coin for 2% interest per month. It's about 24% interest per year for 1 year. The request for payment in gold coin was not unusual during and following the Civil War. Before then, the United States' only legal tender was gold and silver coins. Private banks issued paper currency, and if they failed, the notes were worthless. During the war, to support the war effort, the federal government started printing banknotes. The back was printed in green ink, and therefore greenbacks. The value of these two types of legal tender varied widely over the years, and it was not until about 1878 that the greenback rose in value to become on par with gold. The Moore family was unable to pay the debt, and it became necessary to sell their land. William moved to a farm 3 miles east of Covello in Columbia County, near where his son Moses had purchased a claim. Wellington, 22, Leet, 20, and Eunice, 17, moved with their parents. When William and Priscilla were in their 60s, they moved in with their son Leet. Moses served on the vigilante committee since there was no organized enforcement in the area. Eastern Washington was mostly controlled by the vigilante committee and six-shooters. If a man was an outlaw, he was apt to be found hanging under a tree. His wife was not happy about it, but he said there had to be law and order to protect the law-abiding citizens. The Moores were a talented musical family. Quote, the Moses Moore house was known as the party house. People would arrive in their buggies and on horseback. There was music playing, singing, and dancing until the wee hours of the morning. The Moores loved to sing and play and recorded their music on their old Edison cylinder-type records, unquote. The William Moore family members and their descendants eventually purchased land and farmed in neighboring Whitman and Garfield counties. And you can see here is Covello here in Columbia County, and this whole area is where they eventually settled. When William Moore died on January 31st, 1885 at the age of 69, Priscilla and Eunice continued to live with Leet. Priscilla died March 8, 1898 at age 81. Eunice, who had never married, died the following year at age 41. They are buried at a cemetery named variously Evans, Turner, or Union Cemetery north of Covello, just past Dayton, Washington. William's daughter, Sarah Moore Barnett, and her husband, Asa, had been living on or near the Moore family in Walla Walla County during their early married years. Their first 4 children were born there. By 1870, they lived in the part of the Wallula district, now known as Gardena, just south of Touchy. By about 1875, they had moved to the town of Wallula on the Columbia River. Milan Barnett, the son of Asa and Sarah, talked about his life in the Walla Walla Union Bulletin on February 28, 1954. Quote, Barnett, born on what had been known as the Bill Reeser Place, rates at 85, one of the oldest county native sons. The Reeser Place is just outside of Walla Walla, southeast of town, to Prospect School and turn left. And it was here that the octogenarian first saw the light of day, January 3rd, 1869. Shortly after Milan's birth, his father Asa sold his holdings in the valley and moved his family to the then expanding Wallula. Milan was 6 then, and he attended a little schoolhouse that was located off to one side of the adobe walls of the old Fort Walla Walla. Of the schooling of those days, Milan simply said, "We only had school 2 to 3 months at a time. 3 months was a long time. Never had school like now. As soon as I got big enough to work, I worked." Probably 30 to 40 pupils attended the school, he added. During the years 1875 until 1882, when he was 13, Milan lived in the home near the site of the old fort, now covered with several feet of water backed up behind McNary Dam. Of the fort, he said, the old adobe walls were still up, probably 14 to 16 feet high, and used mostly as an ice house during the time I lived there. It was owned by the steamboat company working the river to Lewiston. Milan recalled that in 81 and 82, they moved to a relocated site, but the Barnets did not. Instead, in the spring of 82, they moved from the area entirely to buy a farm in Prescott, and here they stayed until 1936. The two Barnett brothers farming it after their father's death until in 1898, and until 1936, when their mother passed on, unquote. Isabel Linklater Raymond, a granddaughter of Asa and Sarah, related that her grandparents ran a boarding house while they lived in Wallula. She said her mother, Mary Barnett Linklater, met her husband there when he sailed up the Columbia River. Asa Barnett died in May 1898, and his wife, Sarah Moore Barnett, died in October 1937. They're both buried in the Ivy Cemetery in Prescott, Washington. These are a few of the many photos across the years of Sarah Elizabeth Moore Barnett. The photograph on the right was taken with a great-great-grandson in 1935. She died on October 28, 1937 in Prescott, Washington at the age of 90. She was the last surviving member of the Moore family who had traveled together on the Oregon Trail. Since that time and through the generations, the various families have spread out over the countryside, but there are still many descendants in Walla Walla, Columbia, Garfield, and Minnesota counties. The Moore and Barnett families and their descendants continued to stay close. They exchanged photographs and met up for family gatherings and reunions. Several books were written about the family and told of their early lives in the valley. The families value the stories, pictures, and other mementos, such as a crazy quilt with names and dates from the early 1900s. This photo is of an early reunion at the Barnett Ranch in Prescott, Washington. By 1920, they had started a Moore family reunion, which they formally organized with officers in June 1929. That year, there were 177 relatives and descendants at the reunion, which they held in City Park, now known as Pioneer Park. Relatives came from Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. The reunions are and were held yearly in June. A ledger book started in 1947 contains the names and addresses of those who have attended. Over the years, the venues had changed from the then City Park to other parks, including Lewis and Clark Park, and is now held at a private home. Last year, during the pandemic, was the only year the reunion was not held since its beginning 100 years ago. The next reunion is to be held this coming Sunday. Sarah's shown here with two brothers and sister and taken to Prescott about 1920. Sarah was often photographed with her brothers at reunion time, and upper right is with her children. While the original pioneers from these families are no longer with us, their descendants continue to live and work in the valley. Here's the bibliography that shows you the names of the books that I have used for these quotes in this presentation. And also I have my email address on there if you have questions that we don't have time for right now. So I will turn this back over to Groover.
Okay, well, let me look here. If you have any questions, you can use the Q&A button. We have a couple in here. So someone asks, I would love to know where you found these historical accounts and quotes. Did this information come from letters or journals?
The last slide there with the names of the books on there is where I found these. I have Betty Lucer was one of the women who wrote about the Moore family. A Long Trip on the Prairie Schooner was written by Joel Barnett, who was, as a young child, came on the trip. And then there's another book called Descendants of William Moore, which also gives information about this. And then there's a couple of letters as well. So you can use my email address, and if you need more information about those, if you can't see the bibliography there.
Let's see, someone asked, how common was it for pioneers traveling on the Oregon Trail to break off in Walla Walla? And was there any other stopping place around there at the time?
I don't know the answer. There were, I guess I'll just leave it at that I don't really know the answer to that question. That there's not much other places to stop on the trail along the way, because there were no towns. There were forts along the way, Fort Boise, Fort Hall. There were several along in Idaho and other along the way, but really no towns.
Let's see, okay. Next question is, how large was Walla Walla in the late 1850s? What was in the town?
The population in about 1860 was about 1,300 people in Walla Walla County. And at that time, Walla Walla County would have been larger than it is now. So not very many.
Let's see. Did the Barnard brothers ever find gold in Idaho?
You know, I don't know the answer to that. I would guess that they didn't find very much if they did, because they would have probably paid off their dad's debts if they had. So
if they recorded that $5 squirrel story, that maybe that was the most they made.
yeah, it could have been, I don't know.
Mike Denny says, outstanding presentation. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
And how long did the Barnett's trip take to get to Washington?
Okay. Let me think. I think I had that.
5 months.
Yeah, it was about 5 months. Oh, 5 months and 6 days there was.
6 days.
Yeah. And so then it took them about 3 months to go back.
Right. What happened to the 40-pound kettle they took with them? That sounds pretty heavy for a wagon.
I don't know the answer. I just know that they had it, and it was with the family at some point after that time, but it doesn't say what happened to it since then.
Okay. Let's see. I think that's all the Q&A questions I see here. Let me just check the chat sometimes. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, Donna.
Thank you.
Alan Kopp also says thank you. Okay, well, thank you all for coming today. You should be getting an email in the next couple of days that will have the link to this recording. And maybe I should add your email in there as well. Okay. Again. So
it's on the last slide as well.
Yeah. So go ahead and send us any questions. And don't forget to next month's After Hours. It's always on the last Thursday of every month. And we might be going back to in person, but we'll also continue having an online live component, and we'll keep recording those. So stay tuned for that, and sign up for email list to keep up to date with news. So thank you all and have a good night.